guyananews.com.
Good day with your major newscast. I am Jessica Daw. First with the highlights. A United States-funded governance assessment recommends that the People's Progressive Party and the Partnership for National Unity share political power. A former Indigenous Peoples Ministerial Advisor is objecting to Vice President Barajagdio's claims about Amerindian rights to minerals. Labor and workplace safety officers have started inspecting vessels that are producing and exploring for oil. In the region, Antigua and Barbuda's police are complaining about bad conditions of work, and Barbados ends its COVID curfew from today. You will have also your international news coming from the BBC.
Advertise with us on News Talk Radio Guyana 103.1 FM for best coverage on programs on motivation, beauty and health, parenting and relationships, knowing your rights, and a variety of enlightening content, and get value for your money. Call our helpful staff today on 223-1056 or 223-1041 today.
Now for the news in detail. A democracy and governance assessment prepared for the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, says Guyana's two major political parties need to engage in power sharing. The 2021 assessment says the People's Progressive Party and the Partnership for National Unity plus Alliance for Change need to move away from the current winner-take-all system. The USAID-funded report states that power sharing will ensure that the unprecedented wealth in oil reserves can be transparently and equitably managed for the benefit of all Guyanese. According to the assessment, the National Assembly, a possible mechanism for initiating reform discussions and formalizing power sharing, has been combative at best. The document states that inequitable distribution of oil wealth will exacerbate the deep disparities between regions and ethnic groups, so social protection and cash transfers will become important for the country's poorest and most vulnerable. The Democracy and Governance Assessment recalls that the 2020 parliamentary sessions commenced with parliamentarians trading verbal personal insults rather than engaging in civilized discourse on matters of national importance. While parliamentary decision-making can promote consensus building and compromise, the assessment finds that it only worsens the political divide. The USAID assessment states that the tremendous influx of money opens many avenues for corruption. Further, it notes that any lack of transparency and public engagement could undermine trust in public institutions. A former Indigenous Peoples Ministerial Advisor, Mervyn Williams, has dismissed claims by Vice President Barajagdio that Amerindian people enjoy the rights to minerals. In an interview with the United States-based Vice News, Mr. Jagdio had said that the Amerindian Act provides for Amerindians to have subsurface rights.
We're one of the few countries in the world that gave the Amerindian communities on title lands subsurface rights. So they had rights over the forest, but never the mineral below ground. So now they have subsurface rights in as part of the legislation that we passed.
But Mr. Williams, who was advisor to the then Minister of Indigenous Peoples Affairs, said that such rights had been long advocated for, but the State Lands Act was never amended, and the Amerindian Act of 2006 does not allow for the much desired right to subsurface minerals. Mr. Williams, who is a member of the People's National Congress Reform, says it cannot be fair to cause Guyana's international partners to believe that indigenous citizens here enjoy a right which they do not and have never enjoyed. He argues that the PPP is avoiding a national review of the Amerindian Act because of the strong advocacy for subsurface rights, among other things which he believes the PPP is unwilling to grant. Minister of Labour Joseph Hamilton says labour and occupational safety and health officers have started inspecting oil-producing and other vessels that are working offshore Guyana. He says this is to ensure that ExxonMobil and other companies that are working in the oil sector obey Guyana's labour and safety laws. The Minister of Labour says the oil company will be paying for visits to the floating production, storage and offloading vessels as well as ships that are working offshore. He says that ExxonMobil pays for transporting the officers.
All I can say to you that the arrangement I have with ExxonMobil to ensure that regularly my officers can go on the FPSOs and whatever vessels out there is that it has no cost to the Ministry of Labour.
The Minister of Labour says labour officers will be visiting those vessels once per month. Mr. Hamilton says only 2 Guyanese are trained in inspecting the floating production, storage and offloading vessel. The number of labour officers has been increased from 16 to 26, and occupational safety and health officers have increased from 9 to 30. Barbados's Prime Minister Mia Mottley arrived in Guyana last night, and she is expected to hold talks with President Irfaan Ali. Those talks are expected to be ahead of her speaking at the opening of the Guyana International Energy Conference. She will also hold discussions with President of Suriname, Chandrika Prasad Santokhi, and the President of Ghana, Nana Akufo-Addo. They will also be participating in the Energy Conference. The Barbadian leader was greeted on arrival by a team of government ministers led by the Prime Minister Mark Phillips. Article 13, a Guyanese, the pro-inclusionary democracy organization, is taking the government to task for removing Dr. Rudy Jadupat as the coordinator of the Guyana Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. The Ministry of Natural Resources has claimed that Dr. Jadupat was a member of the Alliance for Change who had been handpicked by the then David Granger-led government. But the AFC and Dr. Jadupat have denied separately that he was a member of that party. Article 13 says it is perplexed at the Ministry of Natural Resources citing Dr. Jadupat's perceived political association as a reason for removing him from the post. That organization says the resonance with the days of the party card is frightening and completely unacceptable. According to Article 13, it is ironic that Dr. Jadupat is being replaced by Dr. Premazir, a known People's Progressive Party associate. Against that background, Article 13 is calling on the civil society representatives of the multi-stakeholder group, which oversees the work of the EITI Secretariat, to reconsider their participation in the MSG as offering legitimacy to a compromised organization. The governor of Rotary District 7030, Sonia Aline, says Caribbean peoples need to take decisive action against non-communicable diseases. Miss Aline yesterday participated in the Rotary Club of Georgetown Central's commissioning of its Fitness Corner, a healthy lifestyles project in the national park. Speaking with News Talk Radio Guyana shortly after the event, she explained how the project forms part of Rotary's fight in the Caribbean against hypertension, diabetes, heart ailments, and other non-communicable diseases.
The Caribbean is known for its high rates of NCDs, diabetes, high blood pressure, heart, all of that. So Rotary, being the leaders that we are, we really tried to think of a project that all could be involved in. And childhood obesity became the buzzword because we know that we can change children and children influence adults. So we really thought about it. Our past district governor, Lyle Chase, the governor before me, it was his plan, together with our chair, Virginia Assen-Oostenberg from Suriname. And it has really taken off because we recognize that we have a problem and we want to change.
The governor of Rotary District 7030 says steps are being taken to formally approach the 15-nation Caribbean community on the fight against non-communicable diseases. While Ms. Aline believes that Caribbean health ministers are making progress in addressing such diseases, she says Caribbean people must take the lead in changing their lifestyles.
While the ministers of health have done sufficient, it's not just a government thing. It's an individual person in the Caribbean for us to just really take hold of our lives. We are in charge of our lives, and we must make the governments see that we're serious about this. When they see we're serious, they're going to take us seriously.
Sonia Aline, the governor of Rotary District 7030, which is made up of more than 2,000 Rotarians in 73 clubs in 17 countries and territories in the southern Caribbean. Now for the news in the region. St. Kitts and Nevis' Attorney General Vincent Byron Jr. says the Electoral Commission of that Twin Island Federation has recommended the counting of votes at polling stations. Currently, at the close of poll, the ballots are taken to a central location where they are counted. But WINN-FM reports that Mr. Byron Jr. says the proposal to count the votes at polling stations, as well as several other ideas, are to be taken to Cabinet and eventually Parliament. The Attorney General recently met with the Electoral Commission and a supervisor of election. The Attorney General says centralized counting of ballots has been causing delays and there is greater need for a number of logistical arrangements such as security. The Attorney General indicated that there are other recommendations made by the Electoral Commission that need to be formalized and will then be announced to the public in detail. Antigua and Barbuda's Police Welfare Association, PWA, has lodged a scathing rebuke of the police hierarchy and the government for their apparent lack of attention to the needs of the police force. In 2019, the PWA took the hierarchy to task over a number of issues to include unsanitary working conditions at the various police stations across the island, the lack of uniforms, accessibility to housing and lands, medical insurance, and risk allowance for officers. And almost 3 years later, several of these issues, like risk allowance and medical insurance, despite recent commitments by the Minister of Justice and Legal Affairs, Steroy Benjamin, have yet to be resolved. Although commendations were given recently for the newly refurbished Parham Police Station, Chairman of the PWA, Corporal Marilyn Harris, while speaking exclusively to Observer Media, referred to the structure as a slap in the face to her body as the proposed plans that were agreed upon were not carried out. She says work done on the Parham police station were merely the adding of plywood to the barrack room and calling it a police station. She says the PWA had negotiated for new stations at Parham, All Saints and Bowlands, as well as Barbuda, which has been without stations since 2007 after the passage of Hurricane Irma. Police Commissioner Atlee Rodney had, however, announced at the handing over ceremony of the Parham police station that the focus will now turn to Bowlands police station. The 12-hour shifts, the PWA reiterated, is still another area of concern that has not been addressed. While the body has not announced protest action over the outstanding grievances, the executive members are saying they have had enough. Barbados is ending its curfew today, and authorities say that is one of several indicators that the Caribbean island is moving towards the stage of living with COVID-19 for the long haul. A new directive will be in place on that day for 2 weeks. The curfew, which ran from midnight to 5 a.m. daily, the latest of several revisions, will be discontinued. Minister of Health and Wellness Ian Gooding-Edgell says the changes came after a meeting of the Emergency Operations Center, EOC, last Wednesday and were on the recommendation of the CMO. He says the advice of the Emergency Operations Center has always been based on the science and an understanding that Barbados has to embrace economic and social recovery in order to sustain growth and development. He said the Ministry of Health thinks the Omicron outbreak has peaked and the numbers are falling. Approximately 75% of people tested daily do not have COVID. And lastly, in the region in Brazil, a man was shot dead during a riot at the weekend after trouble broke out among Palmeiras fans who had watched their team lose to English club Chelsea in the final of the FIFA Club World Cup. The man, who police said was an off-duty prison guard, was shot outside Palmeiras' stadium in Sao Paulo, where thousands of fans had gathered to watch the match on big screens. Riot police used tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse the crowds. One man was arrested, the statement said. Police say images will be analyzed to identify others involved in the riots. Police continue to patrol the areas to prevent any new disturbances. Chelsea beat the Copa Libertadores champions 2-1 after extra time in the game in Abu Dhabi. Palmeiras were aiming to win the annual tournament for the first time and joined state rivals Corinthians, Santos and Sao Paulo, all of whom have won the trophy played between the top club sides in the world. And here now is your international news coming from the BBC.
Alderson with the BBC News. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said his country is counting on European support in its bid to become a member of NATO. But speaking after talks in Kyiv with the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, Mr. Zelensky said Ukraine might never get there. For his part, Mr. Scholz said it was strange that Russia was bringing up the issue of Ukraine's NATO membership when it was currently not on the agenda. The Ukrainian former Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk told the BBC that Chancellor Scholz could exercise a lot of leverage if he chose to.
Whether Chancellor Scholz could fix the problem alone? No, he can't. But whether we, as the Western world, can really tackle this problem, yes, we can. Americans, tremendous and great job when you decided to ship lethal weapon to Ukraine. France and Germany, they do like a shuttle diplomacy. I don't believe in dialogue with Putin if this dialogue is not supported by a very strong stance, financial, economic and military.
The World Anti-Doping Agency has said it's disappointed that the 15-year-old Russian figure skater Kamila Valieva has been allowed to compete at the Beijing Winter Olympics despite failing a drugs test last year. Witold Banker is the president of WADA.
The doping of children is evil and unforgivable. And the doctors, coaches or other support personnel who are found to have provided performance-enhancing drugs to minors should be banned for life. And personally, I also think that they should be in prison.
Sport's highest court allowed the young athlete to compete to avoid causing her irreparable harm. The decision was welcomed by Russian athletes, but strongly criticised by other delegations. Environmental activists in the Czech Republic have cut off the water supply to the Environment Ministry in Prague in protest at the outcome of a groundwater dispute with Poland. The activists mounted a sign over the disconnected water mains that said environmental justice. A Ghanaian political activist has been charged with treason after being arrested on Friday for comments he made on social media. Oliver Barker-Vormawor was detained after a post in which he threatened to stage a coup if a planned tax on mobile money transfers was introduced. Here's our Ghana correspondent, Thomas Nardi.
The social media activist made an appearance in court on Monday and has been remanded in custody until the 28th of this month. Oliver Barker-Vormawor, a lawyer and convener of pressure group #FixTheCountry, was arrested on Friday when he returned to the country from Britain. The police statement indicated that he was arrested because his statement showed a clear intent to execute a coup in the country if the controversial electronic transaction levy was passed by Parliament.
World News from the BBC. Pro-democracy protests are once again taking place in several cities and towns across Sudan against last October's coup. The demonstrators are also calling for the release of politicians who've recently been detained. 3 who were held last week had all been part of a task force appointed to dismantle the economic and political network set up during the former President Omar al-Bashir's rule of almost 3 decades. Since the coup, about 80 protesters have been killed by the security forces. Naftali Bennett is about to make the first official visit by an Israeli Prime Minister to Bahrain. The Gulf Kingdom was one of 4 Arab states to normalise diplomatic relations with Israel in 2020. From Jerusalem, here's Tom Bateman.
This trip makes history. An Israeli leader flying direct from Tel Aviv to Bahrain, where he'll meet the King and Crown Prince. It comes amid the burgeoning ties between Israel and several Arab states who previously did not recognise the country and now see strategic advantages in diplomatic and military relations. In public, Mr Bennett's 2-day visit will focus on trade and cultural links. Behind the scenes, the talks are likely to centre around the combined threat both countries see from Iran.
A human rights organisation is preparing to take France to the International Criminal Court to demand compensation for victims of nuclear tests in Algeria during the 1960s. The campaigners claim many people suffered cancerous and genetic diseases following 6 years of nuclear explosions. The Algerian president, Abdelmajid Tebboune, has backed the compensation calls. The former chairman of Turkish Airlines, İlker Ayca, will head India's newly privatised national carrier Air India. His appointment was announced by the Tata Group, which founded the airline and bought it back from the government last year, nearly 7 decades after it was nationalised. A senior executive described Mr Ayca as an aviation industry leader. That's the latest world news from the BBC.
And that there was your international news. Here now is a recap of the highlights. A United States-funded governance assessment recommends that the People's Progressive Party and a Partnership for National Unity share political power. A former Indigenous Peoples Ministerial Advisor is objecting Vice President Barra Jagdio's claims about Amerindian rights to minerals. Labour and workplace safety officers have started inspecting vessels that are producing and exploring for oil. In the region, Antigua and Barbuda's police are complaining about bad conditions of work, and Barbados ends its COVID curfew from today. And you had your latest international news coming from the BBC. And that's your major newscast. I am Jessica Daw.
This has been the news, compiled in the News Talk Radio newsroom. For ongoing updates, visit demerarawaves.com, and you can check facebook.com/demwaves and twitter.com/demwaves.